Beings that do not think are silent. But what if all silence is a language? What if we cannot hear it, simply because we have not known how to listen? This is not the story of the silence at the heart of a forest. This is the story of the conversation beneath that silence. Meters below the surface, in absolute darkness, operating like an ancient internet woven from invisible threads. A network where messages, warnings, distress calls, and even kindness are sent. Scientists now call it the Wide Web. But its discovery began with one woman, alone in a forest, asking an impossible question. Could trees be talking to each other? This is a sleep story not just about how plants think, but about how a single idea, one that forever changed humanity's view of nature, was born. So relax, take a deep breath, and let yourself sink into the depths of one of North America's darkest, oldest forests. Time, the mid-1990s. Place, the temperate rainforests of British Columbia. Here, everything overwhelms you by scale. Giant cedars, hemlocks blocking the sky, centuries-old pines. The air is sharp with the scent of needles and damp earth. And here, in this realm of giants, a young forest ecologist named Suzanne Samar is trying to understand why the saplings planted by the timber industry keep getting sick and dying. The official science says, competition, every plant for itself. But Samar has a feeling, an intuition. It's a feeling that will lead her to one of the most beautiful and loneliest experiments in the history of science. Until that moment, the plant world was considered passive. They grew, photosynthesized, reacted, but communicate? That word was reserved for animals with brains and nervous systems. Samar's idea was borderline heretical, but she had asked the right question. And the right question forces you to look in the right place, below the soil. Because there in the unseen kingdom, fungi reign. A massive colony of thread-like, white filaments. The mycorrhizal fungal network. This network is not a parasite. It is a symbiont, a partner. It weaves itself around the tiniest root hairs of trees and plants, creating a living interface. The fungus is a master miner, extracting water and precious nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, from the soil with far greater efficiency than any root. In exchange, the tree, a master solar energy harvester, pays a tax, sugar, carbon, the very essence of life, siphoned from sunlight. This barter system was known, but Samar saw something else in this exchange. She saw a network, a highway. What if this highway wasn't just for trading goods? What if it was for sending information? Her hypothesis was as simple as it was radical. Trees, connected by these fungal threads, could be sharing resources, not randomly, but intentionally. A strong, established tree might help a struggling seedling. A tree under attack by insects might warn its neighbors. The forest might not be a battlefield of competing individuals, but a cooperative community, a society with its own rules of engagement and mutual aid. To test this, she needed a forest laboratory. She chose a plot of mixed forest, tall, mature paper birch and Douglas fir trees, with younger saplings scattered beneath. Her tools would be not just shovels and notebooks, but the tools of nuclear chemistry. She acquired small amounts of radioactive isotopes, carbon-14 for the birch, a different tracer, carbon-13, for the fir. These isotopes are safe, but detectable with a Geiger counter or a mass spectrometer. They are like adding a unique, invisible glow to a molecule of sugar. On a day that likely started with the chill fog of a Pacific Northwest morning, Samar and her small team began the delicate work. They selected a mature birch tree. They sealed it inside a large, clear plastic bag. Then they injected a syringe of carbon dioxide gas enriched with radioactive carbon-14 into the bag. The tree, continuing its daily work of photosynthesis, would inhale this tagged CO2 and, through the magic of its leaves, incorporate the radioactive carbon into its sugars. If her hypothesis was wrong, that radioactive sugar would stay in the birch. It would fuel its own growth, and that would be that. The silent forest would remain silent. But if her hypothesis was right, if the fungal network was a conduit, then the radioactive sugar might travel. It might flow from the birch's roots into the fungal filaments and out to somewhere else. For days they waited. The forest went about its business. The sun rose and set over the plot. Rain fell. The fungal network, invisible below their feet, hummed with its own secret life. Then it was time to check. With careful precision, they took samples, not from the birch, but from the neighboring Douglas fir saplings. They also took samples from other birch saplings not connected to the mother tree. The samples were sealed, labeled, and sent to the lab for analysis. The wait for the lab results was its own kind of suspense. In her mind, Samar must have replayed the experiment 1,000 times, questioning every step, battling the doubt that plagues every pioneer. The established scientific community viewed her work with deep skepticism. She was challenging a fundamental pillar of ecology, the ruthless competition for resources. She was suggesting altruism in a place where none was thought to exist. Then the data arrived. The numbers told a story that words could barely contain. The Douglas fir saplings, the ones connected to the birch via the fungal network, showed significant levels of radioactive carbon-14. The sugar had traveled. It had moved from the birch, through the underground fungal web, and into the fir. But it wasn't a one-way street. In a reciprocal experiment, where the fir was the donor, the birch received the fir's tracer. They were trading. They were sharing. More than that, the data showed nuance. The flow wasn't constant or equal. It changed with the seasons. In the summer, when the birch was in full leaf and rich with sugar, it sent more carbon to the fir. In the spring and fall, when the evergreen fir was more active, the flow could reverse. It was a dynamic, responsive economy. And it wasn't just between species. Seedlings of the same species, especially those struggling in deep shade, received disproportionate support from their larger, sunlit neighbors. The silent forest was not silent. It was whispering. It was bartering. It was supporting its young. Suzanne Samar had her proof. She had listened to the silence and heard a conversation. That conversation was about survival, but also about connection. It spoke of a world where intelligence is not confined to a brain, but can be embedded in a relationship, in a network, The Wide Web was real. But this discovery in a British Columbia forest was just the first word in a much longer sentence. It opened the door to a flood of questions that would consume Samar and other scientists for decades. If trees share food, could they share warnings? Could they recognize their own kin? Is there a central hub, a mother tree, that orchestrates this flow? And what does this hidden cooperation mean for us, who have only ever seen the forest as a collection of independent objects, waiting to be counted and cut? As the implications of her discovery began to seep into the scientific world, slowly and against much resistance, a new field of understanding started to grow. It suggested that the green world around us is not a backdrop to the drama of animal life. It is a protagonist with its own agency, its own language, its own society, an intelligence of a different kind, slower and more patient than our own, woven into the very fabric of the soil. And it all began because one person dared to question the silence, and instead of assuming it was empty, wondered if it was just speaking in a tongue she had not yet learned to hear. That is where we will pause our first chapter, with the first undeniable evidence that the world beneath our feet is alive with conversation. Let this idea settle in your mind as you relax. The trees outside your window, the potted plant on your sill, they are not isolated. They are nodes in a vast, silent, whispering network. A network that has been thriving since long before we walked the earth. And in that connectedness, there's a strange and ancient peace. The proof was in the data, a faint radioactive signature whispering from one set of roots to another. But for Suzanne Samar, holding those lab reports in a quiet university office, the feeling was not one of simple triumph. It was something deeper, more humbling. She had pulled back a corner of a veil, and the world behind it was vaster and more intricate than she had imagined. The forest was not a collection of silent competitors. It was a community, and like any community, it had its own economy, its own social rules, its own lines of communication. Now the real work began. The single, elegant experiment had to be defended, repeated, and expanded. The skeptical gaze of the scientific establishment was upon her. The old guard of forestry science, built on principles of competition and stand management, viewed her ideas as sentimental, even dangerous. To suggest trees helped each other was to challenge the very economic model of modern forestry, which treated forests as crops of identical individuals. But Samar was not a sentimentalist. She was a rigorous scientist. Her next step was to map the network itself. This meant getting down into the dirt, literally. With teams of students, she began the painstaking work of trenching. They would dig deep, narrow moats around individual trees, severing every root and fungal connection to the outside world. It was a brutal but necessary intervention. By isolating trees, they could see what happened when the network was cut. The results were stark. Seedlings connected to the network thrived. Those isolated by trenches grew slower, were more susceptible to disease, and often died. The network wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was a lifeline. Meanwhile, in laboratories around the world, other scientists were starting to listen to the whispers Samar had helped uncover. In Germany, a young scientist named Peter Wohlben, a forester, began observing similar phenomena in the ancient beech woods he managed. He noted how trees seemed to synchronize their massed years of heavy seed production, how they would leave gaps in the canopy for their ailing neighbors, how stumps of long-felled trees would remain alive for centuries, fed by the roots of their living companions. The evidence was becoming anecdotal, then empirical, then overwhelming. The science of plant communication was being born, but communication requires more than just sharing food. It requires signals, and the forest had its own telegraph system. When a tree is attacked by a hungry beetle, a browsing deer, or a fungal pathogen, it doesn't suffer in silence. It releases a cocktail of volatile organic compounds into the air. To us, this might be the sharp scent of a crushed pine needle or the bitter smell of damaged willow. To a neighboring tree downwind, this scent is a warning siren. Receiving these chemical signals, the neighbor can preemptively ramp up its own production of defensive toxins, making its leaves less palatable before the predator even arrives. This was proven in elegant experiments with tomato plants and sagebrush. The world above ground was also chattering. Then came the most startling discoveries, blurring the line between plant and animal intelligence even further. Researchers like Monica Gagliano began experiments that seemed to belong in a psychology lab, not a greenhouse. She used the classic Pavlovian conditioning model on a plant. She would drop a potted Mimosa pudica plant, the sensitive plant that folds its leaves when touched, from a short height. At first, the plant would defensively curl its leaves. But after repeated, harmless drops, it learned that the fall posed no threat. It stopped curling. It had learned and formed a memory that lasted for weeks. Without a single neuron, it had changed its behavior based on experience. Other experiments showed plants could hear the sound of running water and direct their roots toward it. They could distinguish between the sound of a caterpillar chewing on a leaf and the similar vibrations of wind, mounting a chemical defense only for the former. They had a sense of self, able to recognize their own roots when placed near those of an unrelated plant, competing less fiercely with their kin. Each finding was another brick in a revolutionary new wall of understanding. Plants are not passive automatons. They are sensitive, perceptive beings that integrate information from their environment, light, chemicals, sound, touch, and make calculated decisions about growth, defense, and resource allocation. They have a kind of consciousness, albeit one so alien to our fast, centralized brain-based model that we had failed to recognize it. Samar's work provided the physical architecture for this consciousness, the wood wide web. The fungal network was the internet, the mycelium, the fiber optic cables. The chemical and electrical signals were the data packets. And the trees? They were the users, the servers, the ancient, patient nodes in a biological world wide web that has been online for over 400 million years. As this new science coalesced, a profound metaphor emerged, the mother tree. In Samar's research, certain large, old trees, often the most well-connected nodes in the fungal network, seemed to play a disproportionately important role. They acted as hubs, nurturing seedlings, especially their own offspring, by shunting carbon and nutrients through the network to shaded areas where the young struggled. When these mother trees were injured or dying, they appeared to send a final, massive dump of their resources out into the network, a last will and testament written in carbon and sugar. This finding struck a deep chord, far beyond academia. It spoke to a universal human understanding of kinship, care, and legacy. The implications of this are still unfolding, both for ecology and for us. It suggests that clear-cutting a forest is not like harvesting a field of corn. It is more like bombing a city. It doesn't just remove trees. It destroys a society, severs communication lines, and assassinates the elders who hold the community's knowledge and resilience. It leaves behind an orphaned landscape, silent in a way it never was before. For you, lying in bed, letting this story wash over you, there is a potent peace in this knowledge. The world is more connected than it appears. The loneliness of modern life is an illusion. You are surrounded by intelligence, by communication, by a slow, green wisdom that has been evolving for eons. The potted plant on your nightstand is not just decorating your room. It is a silent, sensing entity. The trees outside your window are in a constant, whispered dialogue about the weather, the pests, the shifting light. You are not separate from this network. You breathe the oxygen they exhale. You are nourished by the fruits of their labor. The carbon in your body was once part of their leaves, their trunks. You are embedded in this web, a faster, noisier, two-legged participant in an ancient conversation. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that web, not as a diagram, but as a feeling, a soft, humming network of connection under the soil of every forest, every park, every garden, a support system that works in silence and darkness, a reminder that life, in all its forms, is fundamentally about relationship, about giving and receiving, about listening. Let that feeling of interconnectedness be your blanket tonight. You are held. You are part of a living, breathing, communicating world. There's no need for words. Just rest within the network. The revelation of the wood wide web did not spread like a gentle breeze through the scientific community. It hit like a tremor, unsettling foundations. For Suzanne Samar, the years following her seminal experiment were a duel on two fronts, one against the entrenched dogma of her field, and another, more personal, against the very industry that managed the landscape she loved. Publishing her findings was a battle in itself. Reviewers for prestigious journals dismissed the work as controversial, a polite word for heretical. The idea of trees cooperating ran counter to the core Darwinian narrative, as it was simplistically understood, of brutal competition driving evolution. Colleagues at conferences would corner her, their arguments sharp. It's just resource exchange, they'd say. It's not communication. It's not intentional. They demanded mechanistic explanations for how the flow was controlled, questions Samar was only beginning to answer. She stood her ground, her voice steady, but her patience often worn thin. Science advances one funeral at a time, the saying goes, and she was asking an entire generation to reconsider its life's work. The resistance was not merely academic, it was economic. The timber industry in British Columbia and beyond operated on a model of efficiency. Clear-cut a swath of land, replant with a single, fast-growing species, usually Douglas fir, and harvest again in 60 to 80 years. This monoculture model was tidy, predictable, and profitable. Samar's research was a direct threat. It showed that these monoculture plantations were biological deserts. Severed from the diverse fungal network of a natural forest, the planted saplings were vulnerable, sickly, and required heavy doses of fertilizer and pesticide to survive. Costs the industry externalized. Worse, her work on mother trees suggested that leaving the largest, oldest trees standing during a cut was not wasteful but essential. They were the nurses, the hubs, the repositories of resilience. Clear-cutting was not harvesting. It was ecocide, severing the neural network of the forest. Samar became an activist scientist. She took her graphs and data slides to forestry conferences, to government hearings, to meetings with logging executives. She spoke not just in the language of carbon isotopes, but in a language of connection that people could feel. She called the fungal networks the social network of the forest. She described mother trees as great ancient giants that hold the forest together. The press loved it. The establishment bristled. Funding for her research dried up from traditional sources. For a time, her university position was precarious. She was told to stick to real science. But the evidence was growing, and a new generation of ecologists was listening. They repeated her experiments in different forests, oak forests in Japan, beech woods in Europe, acacia savannas in Africa. The results held. The Wood Wide Web was a global phenomenon. The science of plant communication expanded into new, astonishing realms. Researchers used sophisticated microelectrodes to detect electrical signals traveling through plant tissues at speeds of up to a centimeter per second, a nerve impulse of the green world used to coordinate defenses. They found that some plants could even communicate across species boundaries using the fungal internet. An imperiled bean plant could send a chemical signal through the mycelium that prompted a neighboring tomato plant to ramp up its own defenses. The most poignant work deepened the mother tree concept. Samar and her students devised experiments where they injured mother trees, either by stripping their bark or injecting them with a pathogen, mimicking an insect attack. They then tracked the flow of carbon. In what can only be described as a deathbed bequest, the injured trees significantly increased the flow of carbon and defensive compounds through the fungal network to neighboring seedlings, especially their own kin. The trees seemed to know they were dying and were investing their remaining resources into the next generation. It was a level of sophisticated, altruistic behavior no one had attributed to plants. This work began to bridge the gap between the cold mechanics of resource transfer and the warm, intuitive concept of communication and care. It suggested that the forest's intelligence was not centralized in any individual, but was an emergent property of the network itself, a distributed intelligence. The forest knew things. It remembered past droughts and the thickness of its tree rings. It anticipated attacks through chemical warnings. It nurtured its young. This was a consciousness of a different order, slower, wider, more patient than our own. For Samar, the personal toll was heavy. Working in clear cuts, the stark, silent, skeletal landscapes left after logging was emotionally draining. "It's like a battlefield," she said. "It just feels so wrong." But she also found profound hope in the resilience of the network itself. In areas where mother trees had been left standing, even amidst the devastation of a clear cut, the regeneration of the forest was faster, healthier, more diverse. The old trees were guiding the recovery, their vast root and fungal systems still alive in the soil, a living blueprint for the community that once was and could be again. Her message evolved from a specific scientific hypothesis into a broader, philosophical plea for humility. "We are not managers of nature," she argued. "We are participants. Our survival is intertwined with the health of these ancient networks. The climate crisis is, in part, a crisis of disconnection, of severing the ties that bind ecosystems together and make them resilient. By understanding and respecting the wood wide web, we don't just save trees. We might just save ourselves." As this new paradigm took root, a quiet revolution began in some forestry practices. A movement called retention forestry gained ground, advocating for leaving patches of forest, especially large old trees, standing within cut blocks to act as lifeboats of biodiversity and fungal connectivity. It was a small, pragmatic acknowledgement of Samar's life's work. The industry hadn't fully embraced her vision, but it could no longer ignore the science. Tonight, as you lie in the dark, let this story reshape your sense of the world outside your window. That oak tree on the street is not a solitary monument. It is a bustling hub. Its roots are in conversation with the roots of the maple across the way, mediated by an unseen world of white filaments. They are sharing news of the day's rain, trading sugars for minerals, perhaps sending warnings about the aphids on the rose bush. The grass in the park is linked in a subterranean gossip ring. The forest in the distance is holding a silent, constant counsel. This interconnectedness is not a metaphor. It is biological fact. It is the reality of life on Earth. And in that reality, there is a deep, abiding comfort. You are not a lone consciousness adrift in an inert universe. You are surrounded by sentience, by community, by a slow, green thought that has been growing for 500 million years. The anxiety of the human world, the buzz of notifications, the pressure of time, the fear of isolation melts away in the face of this older, slower truth. You are part of the web. You always have been. Your breath is part of its cycle. Your life is sustained by its quiet, relentless commerce. So, release the day's tensions into this web. Imagine them flowing down, like water into soil, being absorbed and transmuted by that vast, patient network. There's no problem too large for it has weathered ice ages and asteroids. It knows only growth, connection, and resilience. Let your breathing sync with this older rhythm, not the rapid rhythm of thought, but the slow, pulsing rhythm of sap rising and falling, of mycelium creeping through the dark, of leaves turning minutely toward the moon. This is the rhythm of rest, the rhythm of belonging. We will end this first chapter here, at the edge of sleep, at the root of understanding. Suzanne Samar listened to the silence and heard a conversation. Now you can hear it too. It's the whisper of the web, the oldest story there is, the story of connection. Let it be your lullaby. The idea that would shake the foundations of ecology did not begin in a sterile laboratory or in the pages of a theoretical journal. It was born in the dirt, in the tangible, sap-scented, moss-under-fingernails reality of a British Columbia forest. And it was born in the mind of a woman who wasn't just studying the forest. She was of it. To understand the Wood Wide Web, you must first understand the woman who dared to listen for it. Suzanne Samart's story is not one of a detached academic, but of a forest dweller turned detective. Her childhood was spent in the Monashee Mountains, in a world of endless evergreen, where her family's livelihood was intertwined with trees. Her grandfather and uncles were horse loggers, a practice that, while still extracting timber, demanded an intimate, careful knowledge of the forest. They would select individual trees, cut them, and drag them out with teams of horses, leaving the rest of the stand largely intact. It was a dance with the forest, not a war upon it. In the summers, young Suzanne would roam these logged patches, noticing how life stubbornly returned, the fireweed, the seedlings pushing through the slash. She didn't have the words for it yet, but she was observing resilience, the first hint of a system that could heal. This visceral connection was tempered by another, more brutal reality. As she grew older and pursued forestry at university, the industry was undergoing a revolution. The horses were gone, replaced by behemoth machines, feller bunchers, skidders, loaders, that could clear entire mountainsides in days. The philosophy shifted from selective, relationship-based logging to one of efficiency and volume, clear-cutting. The goal was to replace the messy, biodiverse ancient forest with neat, orderly plantations of a single, commercially valuable species, Douglas fir. It was forestry as factory farming. After university, Samar took a job with the British Columbia Forest Service. Her task was practical and pressing, to figure out why these new monoculture fir plantations were failing. The seedlings, planted with such industrial optimism, were turning yellow, stunted, and dying. The official diagnosis was always the same: competition from weed species like the paper birch and the wild grasses that inevitably moved into the clear-cut. The solution was equally blunt: more herbicides, more pesticides, more brute force suppression of anything that wasn't the chosen crop. But Samar, walking through these silent, sickly plantations, felt a dissonance. In the natural mixed forests nearby, where birch, fir, cedar, and hemlock all grew together in seeming chaos, the trees were vibrant, healthy, and resilient. Why would diversity be a problem in one place, and the supposed cause of death in another? The prevailing dogma of the day, rooted in a narrow interpretation of Darwin, held that plants were in a constant, vicious war for resources: light, water, nutrients. The strongest won, the weak died. In this view, the birch was the enemy of the fir, stealing its light and water. Eliminating the birch should have made the fir thrive. But it didn't. It made it sicker. A quiet rebellion began to form in her mind. What if the textbooks were wrong? What if the relationship wasn't one of war, but of something else? Her childhood memories of the interconnected forest, her family's practical knowledge, and the glaring failure of the industrial model all collided. She began to see the forest not as a collection of individual plants battling for supremacy, but as a society. And in any society, even a competitive one, there is exchange. There is communication. There is sometimes cooperation. The key, she suspected, was hidden below the surface. Everyone focused on the drama above ground, the race for sunlight. But Samar started looking down. When she pulled up a struggling fir seedling, she would see, clinging to its tiny roots, a delicate white fuzz, mycorrhizal fungi. She knew the basics of this symbiosis from textbooks. Fungus helps with water/nutrients. Plant pays with sugar. It was framed as a simple, one-on-one trade. But what if these fungal connections didn't just link a fungus to a single tree? What if they linked tree to tree to tree, creating a network, a marketplace, a communication grid? The idea was thrilling and terrifying. It went against everything she had been taught. To test it, she would need to move from observation to experimentation. She would need tools to trace the invisible flow of resources. And she would need to do it within a scientific and industrial culture that was hostile to the very premise. She returned to university for a PhD. A single mother with 2 young daughters, driven by a question that was both scientific and deeply personal. Her advisors were skeptical. Colleagues thought she was wasting her time on a fringe idea. Funding was scarce. The path of least resistance would have been to study something more conventional, more guaranteed to yield publishable, career-advancing results. But the image of those dying fir plantations and the haunting beauty of the healthy, mixed forest wouldn't let her go. She had to know. Her first experiments were humble, a far cry from the sophisticated radioactive tracer studies to come. She grew birch and fir seedlings together in pots, with and without fungal networks. She painstakingly measured their growth. The early results were suggestive, not conclusive, but they pointed in the direction of her hypothesis. When connected by fungi, the plants seemed to do better. It was enough of a signal to justify a wilder, more ambitious leap. The leap involved isotopes. The idea was audacious. To tag the carbon in one tree's photosynthesis factory and see if that carbon showed up in its neighbor. For this, she needed a forest, not a greenhouse. She needed the complex, messy, real-world web. She secured a research plot in the woods near Kamloops, a dry interior forest of birch and fir. She secured tiny amounts of radioactive carbon, 14 gas, a terrifying proposition that came with a mountain of safety protocols and bureaucratic hurdles. Every step was a battle against doubt, both external and internal. The most profound challenge, however, wasn't technical or bureaucratic. It was philosophical. She was training herself to see the forest in a way almost no one else did. On her daily walks to the research plot, she would stop and simply look. She stopped seeing a stand of timber or a birch competing with a fir. She started seeing individuals with character, the gnarled, old birch that leaned protectively over a cluster of fir saplings, the way sunlight dappled through the canopy in a specific pattern she came to recognize each afternoon. She began to think of the trees not as subjects, but as participants in her experiment. She talked to them. She apologized when she had to bag them for the gas injections. This wasn't mysticism. It was a shift in perspective born of deep attention. She was developing the new eyes her question demanded. The day of the first major isotope injection was a symphony of tension. The equipment was cumbersome. Plastic bags large enough to engulf a small tree. Syringes, gas canisters, seals. The team worked with a hushed intensity. The forest, usually a place of serene noise, felt watchful, silent. As she injected the radioactive carbon dioxide into the bag, surrounding a chosen birch tree, Samar felt a surge of vulnerability. This was the moment of commitment. There was no turning back. If nothing happened, her hypothesis and years of work would evaporate. If something happened, the world might look different. For weeks after, she visited the plot daily. She took soil samples, root samples, needle samples from the target birch and the neighboring firs. The samples were sent off to a lab capable of detecting the faint radioactive signature. The waiting was agony. It was a pregnant silence, filled with the creeping fear of failure and the dizzying hope of discovery. When the call finally came from the lab, she was likely in her modest office, surrounded by maps and graphs. The voice on the other end relayed numbers, data points. And then the confirmation. The radioactive carbon-14 was not just in the birch. It was in the fir. It had traveled. The signal had been sent, and it had been received. And that dry, technical report was a love letter from the forest. It was the first deciphered word of a language humanity had never known existed. For Suzanne Samar, it wasn't just a successful experiment. It was a homecoming. The intuition of the child in the Monashi Mountains, the frustration of the forester in the failing plantation, the stubborn hope of the PhD student, they had all been leading to this one, quiet, revolutionary fact. The trees were talking, and she had learned how to listen. This chapter is not about data points, but about the genesis of a way of seeing. It's about how a deep, embodied love for a place can give birth to a question that changes science. As you rest, consider the power of that simple, radical act, paying such close attention to the world that you begin to hear its secrets. Your own breath is part of this same, attentive exchange. The data from a lab was a solid line on a graph, a statistical certainty. But for Suzanne Samar, standing once more in her research plot, the knowledge was a living, breathing thing that transformed the landscape around her. The birch tree she had injected was no longer just tree #7B. It was a donor, a benefactor. The first sapling a few meters away was no longer just a competitor. It was a recipient, a neighbor in a silent economy. The very air between them seemed charged with intention. She would run her hand over the rough bark of the birch, then walk to the fir and touch its needles, feeling a connection that was now proven, yet still mystical. Science had confirmed a truth that felt in her bones, ancient. This personal epiphany, however, existed within a wall of professional isolation. Presenting her findings to the scientific community was like speaking a foreign language in a room full of skeptics. At her first major conference, she stood before an audience of senior ecologists, their faces etched with the lines of conventional wisdom. She showed her slides, the diagrams of the fungal networks, the graphs with the clear spike of carbon-14 in the receiver trees. The questions that followed were not curious, but challenging, designed to dismantle. "How can you be sure it's not just diffusion?" one asked, his tone implying the answer was obvious. "Have you controlled for every possible root graft?" demanded another. "This cooperation you imply, it's just resource shuffling in a shared medium. Attributing agency to plants is a dangerous anthropomorphism." The word anthropomorphism was wielded like a weapon. To suggest trees helped each other was to be guilty of sentimentality, of projecting human emotions onto mindless biology. Samar defended her work with calm precision, citing her controls, her methods. But she left the podium feeling not exhilarated, but drained. She had not just presented paper. She had challenged a paradigm. Paradigms fight back. The rejection seeped into her career. Grant applications were rejected with comments like, "The proposed mechanism remains speculative," or "The ecological significance of this transfer is unclear." Colleagues she respected would avoid the topic in hallways. Within the male-dominated fields of forestry and ecology, a young woman with a radical, caring hypothesis about trees was easily marginalized. She was told to focus on real forestry problems, like pest control or growth yields. The message was clear. Study the forest as a machine for timber production, not as a community. This period was a test of faith. Doubt crept in during the long, dark British Columbia winters. Was she seeing patterns that weren't there? Was her childhood love for the forest clouding her scientific judgment? She would look at her two young daughters, needing stability, and wonder if she was pursuing a career-ending fantasy. The forest itself, in its winter silence, offered no easy answers. But then, spring would come. She would return to her field sites, and the evidence was in the living world, not the rejection letters. She began a series of elegant, punishing experiments to answer every criticism. To prove it was the fungal network and not just soil diffusion, she used fine mesh bags. Some had a mesh so fine it allowed water and solutes to pass, but blocked fungal hyphae. Others had a mesh wide enough for the fungi to penetrate. The results were unequivocal. Resource transfer only happened when the fungi could connect. The highway was identified. To address the why, she designed experiments that simulated stress. She shaded one tree, mimicking its suppression in the understory. The flow of carbon from its sunlit neighbor increased. She attacked trees with herbivores. Not only did the attacked tree pump defensive compounds into its leaves, but these compounds, or signals to produce them, appeared to travel through the network, priming its neighbors for attack. This wasn't just sharing lunch, it was sending warnings. It was a collective immune response. Each experiment was a battle fought with sweat, dirt, and meticulous data. Each successful result was a small brick in the fortress of her theory. But the fortress was being built in a gale. The forestry industry, feeling the implicit threat to its clear-cutting model, pushed back harder. Research partnerships dissolved. Whisper campaigns suggested her work was soft, not rigorous. The pressure was immense, a constant, low-grade fever of professional anxiety. Yet, in the heart of this struggle, she found her voice. She realized she couldn't just speak the language of peer-reviewed journals. She had to speak the language of the heart. She started writing and talking about the forest, not as a system of inputs and outputs, but as a family. She coined the term Mother Tree. It was a brilliant piece of communication. Scientifically, it referred to those large, old, highly connected hub trees that disproportionately supported the network. But emotionally, it evoked care, nurture, legacy. People who wouldn't understand a mycorrhizal network instantly understood the idea of a mother caring for her young. This shift marked a turning point. The story became bigger than the data. It was a story about connection in a disconnected world, about community in an age of individualism. The media, always hungry for a narrative that bridges science and soul, picked it up. Magazines and documentaries came calling. The public, intuitively feeling the truth in her words, responded with passion. Letters poured in from teachers, gardeners, nature lovers. They told her, "I always felt the trees were talking. Now I know it's true." This public embrace was a lifeline. It gave her the courage to persevere when institutional doors closed. It also began to pressure the institutions themselves. A new generation of graduate students, inspired by her vision, knocked on her door. They weren't burdened by the old dogma. They were excited by the new possibility. Together, they formed small but mighty counterculture within ecology. Samar's personal journey mirrors the very network she discovered. She was like a young seedling, struggling in the shade of a giant, established canopy of old ideas. Her resilience came not from solitary toughness, but from forging connections with a handful of supportive colleagues, with her family, with the public, and ultimately, with the forest itself, which continued to whisper its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. She was not just studying the wood wide web. She was living it, demonstrating that intelligence and resilience arise from relationship. And so, the woman who was once told her ideas were unscientific became the scientist who expanded the very definition of what science could see. She taught us that to understand a forest, you cannot just measure its trees. You must listen to its conversations. You must respect its relationships. You must acknowledge that some of the most important things happen in the silent, dark places, where connections are woven too fine for the casual eye to see, but strong enough to hold a world together. Let this part of the story settle in you. The struggle, the doubt, the unwavering attention that leads to revelation. Your own challenges are part of your network. Your resilience is woven from the connections you nurture, seen and unseen. There is strength in the web. There is wisdom in the quiet, persistent growth. The concept of the mother tree was more than a metaphor. It was a scientific hypothesis born from years of watching the forest's hidden economy. For Suzanne Samar, it began as a pattern in the data. In her experiments, Not all trees were equal nodes in the network. The largest, oldest trees, often hundreds of years old, were superconnected. Their root systems were vast, intertwined with a diverse and massive fungal community. They were the internet hubs of the forest, and the data suggested they weren't just passive hubs, they were active managers. Samar and her students designed experiments to test the motherhood hypothesis. They selected forest plots with identified hub trees, a massive Douglas fir or a towering birch. Then, with careful, surgical precision, they would injure these giants, not by cutting them down, but by stripping a ring of bark girdling to slowly starve the tree, or by introducing a controlled pathogen. It was a difficult, emotionally taxing process. To harm a being you have come to see as elder, a keystone, felt like a betrayal, but it was necessary. They needed to see what happened when a mother tree was in distress. What they found was profound and moving. As the mother tree declined, it didn't hoard its remaining resources. It did the opposite. In a dramatic increase of activity, it began to shunt a significant portion of its stored carbon, the legacy of decades of sunlight, out through its fungal network. And this carbon wasn't broadcast randomly. It was sent with specificity. Higher concentrations flowed to seedlings of its own species, its own kin. Genetic analysis confirmed that the seedlings receiving the most support were often the offspring of the dying tree. The forest was exhibiting kin recognition. A dying mother was bequeathing her estate to her children. This wasn't a slow leak. It was a purposeful, final act of investment. The trees were not just connected, they were familial. They could identify their relatives and privilege them. This discovery bridged a chasm between the plant and animal kingdoms in a way no one had anticipated. It suggested a form of biological altruism, an investment in shared genetic future, operating in a realm without eyes, brains, or conscious thought. The intelligence of the network was achieving sophisticated, evolutionarily smart outcomes through the simple rules of chemistry and connection. The implications rippled out from pure science into the raw heart of human emotion. People heard Mother Tree and understood it immediately. It spoke to a universal human experience of nurture, legacy, and the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. Gardeners started looking at their oldest rose bushes differently. Hikers would pat the bark of a massive oak with a new reverence. Samar had given the world a new archetype, rooted in fact but flowering in the imagination. This public resonance gave her work a power that pure data alone could never achieve. She began to campaign not just as a scientist, but as a witness. She spoke of walking through clear-cuts, those silent, gray, stump-studded landscapes, as walking through graveyards. But not just graveyards of trees, graveyards of relationships. When a mother tree is felled, she argued, you don't just lose a tree. You assassinate a mayor, a library, a central bank. You collapse the network for acres around. The seedlings left behind, or planted afterward, are orphans in a nutritional and informational desert. This, she posited, was the core reason why monoculture plantations failed. They were communities of orphans, disconnected, vulnerable, and dumb. Her message became a cornerstone of the growing movement for ecological forestry, or retention forestry. The idea was simple. When logging, leave the mother trees. Leave clusters of legacy trees, not just as seed sources, but as living hubs to nurse the next generation. Leave the web intact. This was heresy to industrial forestry, which calculated board feet and saw legacy trees as wasted volume. But the science and the powerful story it told was becoming undeniable. Samar's personal journey reached a symbolic peak when she confronted her own family's legacy. Her brothers were loggers, working within the very system her research critiqued. Family gatherings could be tense. She wasn't an outsider pointing a finger. She was a sister, a daughter of the woods, saying the family business needed to change. It was a painful, intimate division that mirrored the broader conflict. Yet through it, she never lost her love for the people of the forest, only her tolerance for its destruction. She advocated not for an end of forestry, but for a smarter, more humble kind, one that saw itself as a partner in the forest's own cycles of death and renewal, not as an external force imposing its will. Today, the science of the wood wide web is foundational. New studies reveal its staggering complexity. Trees can trade not just carbon, but nitrogen, phosphorus, water, and defensive chemicals. The network can be hijacked by parasitic plants, or manipulated by clever fungi playing all sides. It has cybersecurity flaws and benevolent firewalls. It is a mature field of study, and at its root is the simple, revolutionary idea that a forest is a cooperative system. For you, listening now, this knowledge is an invitation to a deeper peace. The world outside is not a collection of objects, but a subject, a community, a conversation. The stress of human life often comes from a feeling of isolation, of being a lone mind adrift. But you are not adrift. You are surrounded by a thriving, communicative intelligence. Every time you pass a tree, you are passing an entity that is in dialogue with its world, that remembers, learns, and cares for its kin in its own slow, green way. This understanding can soften the hard edges of your own consciousness. You are not separate from nature. You are a participant in its oldest conversation. The air you breathe is their exhalation. The stability of your climate is their legacy. Your well-being is intertwined with the health of the network. So, as you rest, imagine your own awareness sinking down, like water through soil, past the concrete, past the pipes, into the cool, dark humus. Imagine feeling the subtle, electric hum of the mycelial network, a feeling of connection stretching for miles. Imagine your worries as chemical signals being absorbed, diluted, and transformed by this vast, patient system. The network does not judge, it integrates. It turns decay into growth. It turns loss into connection. You are part of this cycle. Your breath is part of this exchange. Your life is a node in a web far wider than you can see. There is no true isolation. There is only relationship, seen and unseen. Let this knowing be the bedrock of your rest tonight. You are held. You are connected. You are home. The crystalline tones and ambient drone blend, then gradually simplify to a single, warm, unwavering tone, like the sustained note of a forest's heart. Hold for 30 seconds. This is the end of our second chapter. The story of the woman who listened, and in listening, discovered a motherhood in the roots of the world. She heard the forest's whisper, and it changed everything. Now, let the whisper become your lullaby. The summer of 1997 in the dry interior forests of British Columbia was not marked by dramatic storms or unusual heat, but in a specific, carefully chosen hectare of land near Kamloops, a quiet revolution was being prepared. This was the stage for Suzanne, Simard's definitive experiment. The hypothesis was set. Trees share resources through fungal networks. The tools were radical, radioactive isotopes. The world was watching, not literally, but the weight of scientific consensus hung in the dry air like dust. This was the test. Everything led to this. The preparation was a military campaign against uncertainty. The research plot was mapped to the centimeter. Every birch, every fir, every seedling was tagged, measured, and catalogued. Soil samples were taken to map the existing fungal communities. The team, a small band of dedicated graduate students and technicians, operated with a focus that bordered on reverence. They were not just setting up an experiment. They were preparing to ask the forest a direct question, and they needed to understand every nuance of its language to properly hear the answer. The core of the experiment was deceptively simple in concept, maddeningly complex in execution. They would label the carbon in a specific donor tree. To do this, they needed to encapsulate part of the tree in a sealed environment and introduce a traceable form of carbon dioxide for it to breathe. The tree would do the rest, incorporating the labeled carbon into its sugars through photosynthesis. Then they would wait, and then they would hunt for that labeled carbon in the surrounding trees, the receiver trees. The choice of tracer was critical. They needed two different, distinguishable signatures. For the birch donors, they used carbon-14, a radioactive isotope. For the fir donors and reciprocal plots, they used carbon-13, a stable but heavier isotope. This allowed them to trace flows in both directions in the ecosystem. Securing the radioactive carbon-14 involved a labyrinth of safety protocols, licensing, and bureaucratic hurdles. The tiny canister of gas was treated with the solemnity of a nuclear core. The chosen donor trees were not the largest giants, but mature, healthy individuals. On the appointed day, the atmosphere in the camp was tense. The equipment seemed clumsy and invasive against the forest's grace. Large, clear plastic bags, custom-made chambers, were carefully fitted over sections of the tree's canopy, sealed airtight at the base around the trunk with soft foam and tape. It looked like a tree wearing a giant, crinkly veil. The tree was now in its own atmosphere. Then came the moment of injection. Samar, clad in safety gear, would approach with the syringe of gas. The Geiger counter in her hand emitted a steady, baseline click-click-click. She would insert the needle through a sealed port in the bag. A hiss. The gas, enriched with carbon-14, would fill the chamber. The click-click-click of the Geiger counter would escalate momentarily, a tiny storm of artificial radioactivity contained in plastic, then settle. For the next hour, the tree inside its plastic cocoon would photosynthesize under the real sun, breathing in the tag CO2, weaving the radioactive carbon into the very fabric of its being, into the sucrose and glucose that were its lifeblood. During that hour, there was nothing to do but wait and watch. The forest carried on. Birds called, ignorant of the miniature drama. The team would sit in the shade, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes glued to the bagged tree. Was it wilting? Was it accepting the gas? This was the point of no return. The labeled carbon was now in the wild, inside a living system. They had released the tracer into the maze. After the hour, the bags were carefully removed. The tree stood free again, now carrying a secret payload in its sap. Then the real waiting began. The theory was that if the fungal network was a conduit, the labeled carbon, converted to sugar, would travel from the leaves down to the roots. There, it would be exchanged with the mycorrhizal fungi for nutrients. And the fungi, living threads connecting multiple trees, would carry some of that sugar to their other partners, the receiver trees. Days passed. The team visited the plot daily, but there was no visible change. The forest looked exactly the same. The anxiety was a physical presence. Had the carbon stayed put? Had it dissipated? Was the entire painstaking, costly exercise a beautiful failure after a predetermined period, long enough for the carbon to cycle through the system? The harvest began. This was forensic botany. With surgical precision, they took samples, not just from the donor tree, but from target receiver trees at various distances. They took root samples, careful to trace which roots were mycorrhizal. They took needle and leaf samples. They took soil samples from the rhizosphere, the zone directly influenced by the roots. Every sample was a question. Are you here? The samples were placed in vials, labeled with cryptic codes that held the key to the experiment's map. They were packed in dry ice and shipped to an advanced isotope ratio mass spectrometry lab. This machine could detect the faintest signature of carbon-14 or the subtle shift in carbon-13 ratio. It was the only instrument that could read the forest's secret message. The wait for the lab results was the longest period of all. It stretched into weeks. Samar returned to her university office, to her teaching, to her life as a mother. But her mind was in that Kamloops plot, and in the humming, vacuum-sealed chamber of a mass spectrometer hundreds of miles away. Every phone call made her heart jump. Doubt returned in waves. She rechecked her field notes, her maps. Had they contaminated a sample? Had they mislabeled a vial? Then the email arrived. The subject line was neutral. Data for Project 447B. She opened it. It contained spreadsheets, columns of numbers, ratios, p-values. For a moment, it was just noise. Then, her trained eye began to parse it. She scanned for the control samples, receiver trees that were not connected via the mycelial network, thanks to trenching experiments. Their carbon-14 levels were baseline, natural background. Then she looked at the data from the target receivers. The numbers were different. Not wildly different, but statistically significantly different. The p-value was less than 0.01. The signature was there. Carbon-14 was present in the fir trees that were connected to the labeled birch. It had traveled. It had moved through the soil, not by diffusion, but through the living pipeline of the fungal network. In the reciprocal plots, carbon-13 from the fir was found in the birch. She stood up from her desk. The office was quiet. The hum of the computer fan was the only sound. But in her mind, a deafening silence had just been shattered. The data on the screen was a single, deciphered word from a language millions of years old. The forest had answered, and the answer was yes. The feeling was not one of loud triumph, but of immense, humbling quiet. It was the satisfaction of a puzzle piece clicking into place with such perfect certainty that it changed the picture entirely. She had conversed with the forest using the language of isotopes, and the forest had spoken back in the language of connection. The Wide Web was not a metaphor. It was a physiological fact, a highway for carbon, a channel for communication. She had proven it. That night, under the stars, the forest around her home must have felt profoundly different. It was no longer a collection of individuals. It was a shimmering, interconnected whole. Every rustle of leaves was part of a larger conversation. Every root tip was a terminal in the living internet. She had looked into the silence and seen the wires. The data was irrefutable, but in science, data alone does not change minds. It is the story told with that data. Samar now faced the task of translating the silent, isotopic yes from the forest into a language the academic world would hear. She wrote the paper with meticulous care. Every claim was anchored in a datum. Every potential criticism was preempted with control experiment. The title was modest, technical. Net transfer of carbon between tree species via underground mycorrhizal networks. It was submitted to Nature, one of the most prestigious journals in the world. The response was not acceptance. It was a gauntlet. The reviews came back, a pages-long document of skepticism. The referees, anonymous experts in the field, picked at every seam. The statistical methods were questioned. The possibility of alternative pathways was raised incessantly. One reviewer called the interpretation speculative and tinged with anthropomorphic bias. The paper was rejected. This was the first major battle in the war for acceptance. The rejection from Nature was a blow, but not a defeat. It was a map of the opposition's defenses. Samar and her team revised, strengthened, added more controls. They submitted to another top journal, Science. Another rigorous review, another rejection, though this time with slightly more encouraging comments. The scientific establishment was a fortress with high walls, and she was trying to batter down the gate with a new idea that threatened the old guard's life's work. Finally, the paper found a home in Nature's slightly less flashy, but still highly respected sibling journal. When it was published in 1997, it did not immediately set the world on fire. It was a dense, technical read, but for those in the know, it was a seismic event. Citations began to trickle, then flow. Other researchers, intrigued or provoked, tried to replicate the findings. Some failed initially, often due to methodological differences, but slowly, across different forest types and with refined techniques, the core finding held. Carbon moved through mycorrhizal networks between plants. The real resistance, however, was not in the journals, but in the lecture halls and at industry conferences. Samar would present her findings, and the reaction from old-school foresters was visceral. She was accused of being a tree hugger, masquerading as a scientist. At one forestry conference, a senior industry scientist stood up during the Q&A and said flatly, "Mycorrhizae are just a curiosity. They have no bearing on forest management." The room, filled with men in checked shirts and boots, seemed to agree with a collective, silent nod. The economic model of industrial forestry was built on the principle of competition. Her discovery of cooperation was not just scientifically inconvenient, it was economically subversive. It suggested that their practices, clear-cutting, monocultures, herbicide use, were not just harsh, but biologically stupid, actively destroying the very support systems that made forests resilient. Samar learned to armor herself not with aggression, but with deeper, more unassailable data. She embarked on the next phase, mapping the network's ecology. If trees were talking, who were the key conversationalists? Her experiments grew more sophisticated. She began using multiple isotopic tracers at once, following the flow of not just carbon, but nitrogen and water. She explored how the network behaved under stress, during drought, or when one tree was shaded. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated, responsive economy. Source and sink trees changed roles with the seasons and conditions. A birch in full summer sun became a carbon philanthropist to a shaded fir. In the spring, the evergreen fir, already active, might support the deciduous birch just breaking bud. Then came the work that would capture the public imagination in a way graphs never could. The mother tree experiments. By injuring large, hub trees and tracing the flow of resources, she showed these elders weren't just participants. They were active managers, even in death. The discovery that they preferentially sent resources to their kin added a layer of narrative depth that resonated with something fundamental in the human psyche. It was a story of family, legacy, and sacrifice. Science journalists latched onto it. The term "wood wide web" entered the popular lexicon. This public fame was a double-edged sword. It gave her a platform and a measure of protection. But within academia, it sometimes bred resentment. Colluders whispered that she was a popularizer, that her media work diluted her science. The criticism stung, but she realized the communication was part of the science. The old model of science in an ivory tower had failed the forests. To change practices, she needed to change minds, and that required speaking a language people understood. That a pivotal shift came from an unexpected place: complexity theory and network science. As these fields grew in the early 2000s, they provided a new mathematical language for her biological discovery. Ecologists who studied the internet, social networks, or neural networks began to look at her fungal maps and see familiar patterns: scale-free networks, hub-and-spoke architectures, small world properties. The forest was a complex adaptive system, and the mycorrhizal network was its information processing substrate. This framing elevated her work from a botanical curiosity to a central case study in a new scientific paradigm. She was no longer just a forest ecologist. She was a network scientist studying one of Earth's oldest and most vital networks. Gradually, the tide turned. Awards came. Invitations to speak at major conferences became commonplace. The young graduate students who had once been a fringe group were now at the forefront of a vibrant new field. The industry, while not transformed, began to adopt small concessions. Variable retention harvesting, leaving patches of trees, including large legacy trees, within cut blocks, gained traction as a policy, partly due to the mounting evidence of the ecological value of those hubs. For Samar, the greatest validation came not from awards, but from walking into an old-growth forest and knowing that beneath her feet, 1,000,000,000,000 chemical conversations were happening, knowing that the towering cedar she leaned against was likely a mother tree, its roots intertwined with centuries of fungal partners, its canopy sheltering generations of its offspring. The silence was now full of meaning. It was the sound of a working, talking, thinking forest. And for us, the profound lesson is this: intelligence is not a monopoly of the brain. It can be distributed. It can be slow. It can be silent. It can emerge from the collective behavior of simple parts, root cells, fungal hyphae, chemical gradients, forming a system that learns, remembers, adapts, and cares. The forest thinks with its whole body. As you lie in the quiet dark, let this thought reconfigure your sense of self. Your own consciousness is a brilliant, lightning-fast network of neurons. But it is not the only kind of mind in the world. There are other slower, vaster minds all around you. In the park, in the garden, in the forest. Minds that measure time and seasons, that communicate in chemicals, that make decisions over years. You are surrounded by ancient, patient thought. Feel your own frantic. Human worries soften in the presence of this slower, greener intelligence. Your problems are not ignored. They are simply placed in a larger, more patient context. The network has weathered ice ages. It knows how to endure, how to adapt, how to support its own. You are part of a family of intelligences, all dreaming their own dreams under the same sun. The sounds of the university fade away, replaced by a return to the pure, deep, ambient forest drone. It feels wiser now, more complex, layered with the faintest echo of crystalline data tones and the soft, rhythmic pulse of a slow heart. This chapter of discovery closes not with a bang, but with a deep, settling knowing. The experiment was a success. The conversation has been proven. Now we can rest within its truth. The publication of Samar's findings was not an end, but a genesis. A seed had been planted in the hard soil of scientific orthodoxy, and now it began to germinate, sending out intellectual hyphae into adjacent fields. The discovery of the Wood Wide Web did not just add a new fact to ecology. It initiated a quiet revolution in how we understand life's fundamental architecture. A new era was dawning, one where connection would be seen as the rule, not the exception. The first domain to be transformed was ecology itself. For decades, the dominant model was the green world hypothesis, focused on predator-prey dynamics and competitive exclusion. Plants were often treated as the passive backdrop to this animal drama, their interactions limited to a brutal scramble for light and soil. Samar's work forced a profound pivot. Plants were not passive. They were active agents in a social landscape. The focus shifted from individuals to networks, from competition to the dynamics of exchange and cooperation. The forest floor was no longer just dirt. It was a trading floor, a diplomatic zone, a neural lattice. This new perspective unlocked explanations for old mysteries. Why were diverse forests more resilient to pests and disease? Now the answer was clear. A diverse forest supported a more robust and versatile communication network. A warning about a bark beetle could be transmitted through multiple fungal pathways. A tree struggling in a drought could receive emergency rations from a neighbor with a different root depth. Biodiversity wasn't just a nice-to-have. It was the foundation of systemic intelligence and health. Monocultures, by contrast, were revealed as ecological dunces, isolated, vulnerable, and ignorant. The revolution spread to forestry science, albeit slowly and against resistance. A new generation of researchers, armed with network theory and systems thinking, began to challenge industrial practices. They published papers with titles like Mycorrhizal Networks as Forest Resilience Hubs and the Ecological Costs of Mycelial Disruption. The language of forestry started to shift. Timber yield was still a goal, but now it had to be balanced against network integrity, hub retention, and mycorrhizal inoculum potential. It was no longer enough to count trees. You had to map their relationships. Samar, once a pariah, became a sought-after consultant. She worked with progressive First Nations communities in Canada who had never lost their view of the forest as a living, interconnected family. Their traditional knowledge, which spoke of trees as relatives and clear-cuts as wounds, now found a powerful ally in Western science. Together, they designed forestry plans that mimicked natural disturbance patterns, leaving mother trees, creating patches of varying ages, preserving fungal corridors. This wasn't nostalgia. It was sophisticated biomimicry, leveraging millions of years of evolutionary R&D. The most significant practical shift was the adoption of variable retention harvesting. Instead of shaving a mountainside clean, loggers would leave behind clusters of trees, especially the largest ancients. These retained patches were no longer seen as wasted timber, but as lifeboats of biodiversity and fungal networks. They would act as nurseries, seed sources, and communication hubs for the regenerating forest. The cut block would heal faster, be more resistant to disease, and ultimately produce more timber over the long term. It was a classic case where ecological wisdom and economic interest, given a long enough timeline, could align. Beyond forestry, the ripples touched agriculture. The soil food web concept gained new traction. Farmers began to understand that the health of their crops depended on the unseen fungal partnerships beneath the soil. Practices like no-till farming, cover cropping, and compost application were revitalized, not just as ways to add nutrients, but as ways to nurture the mycorrhizal internet that fed and protected their plants. The war on weeds and pests began to look like a counterproductive assault on the very network that could help crops resist them. In the realm of pure science, The discovery was a gateway drug to a new view of intelligence. Neuroscientists and philosophers took note. The mycorrhizal network displayed hallmarks of a cognitive system. It integrated information, chemical signals from multiple trees, made decisions where to allocate resources, learned from experience, seasonal patterns, past attacks, and possessed a form of memory, changes in fungal growth patterns. It was a swarm intelligence made of root and fungus. This forced a radical expansion of the concept of mind. Perhaps mind is not something that happens only inside skulls, but a property that can emerge in any sufficiently complex information processing network, whether made of neurons, mycelium, or silicon. For the public, the Wood Wide Web became a powerful symbol in an age of anxiety. In a world frayed by digital distraction, social division, and ecological crisis, here was a story of profound, ancient connection. It was a tangible, scientific basis for the feeling many had in nature, a feeling of belonging to something larger. It offered a narrative of hope. If a forest can act as a cooperative community, perhaps we can too. It wasn't just about saving trees. It was about remembering that we are nodes in the same planetary network, and that our survival depends on the health of the connections. Suzanne Simard's legacy, therefore, is not a single discovery, but a shift in perception. She gave us a lens. Through it, we no longer see a forest. We see a society. We no longer see a field of wheat. We see a network community. We no longer see soil. We see a living, communicative fabric. This is the birth of an era, the era of connection ecology. And for you, in this moment, this era offers a deep, somatic peace. Your sense of isolation is an illusion of scale and speed. You are connected through the air you breathe, the food you eat, the microbial life on your skin, to this vast, whispering web. Your breath is part of its atmosphere. Your body is built from its carbon. Your consciousness is a spark in a universe teeming with other forms of sentience. So, as you rest, let this connectedness be your anchor. You are not a lonely thinker in a silent universe. You are a participant in the oldest conversation on Earth, the chemical, electrical, fungal whisper that says, I am here. Are you there? Let's share. Let's survive. Let's grow. This is the dawn born from a single question in a Canadian forest. A new way of seeing. A new way of being. And it is just beginning. The revolution sparked in the soil of British Columbia did not stay confined to academia or forestry manuals. Like the mycelial network itself, the idea spread, connecting disparate fields and cultures, revealing a new story for humanity, one we desperately needed to hear. As the climate crisis accelerated, the Wood Wide Web offered a crucial, missing piece of the puzzle: resilience. Climate models had long focused on atmospheric carbon and temperature, but the stability of the entire system, the forests that are the planet's lungs and carbon sinks, depended on something unseen below. A forest with an intact fungal network is a forest that can withstand drought better, as water can be shared. It's a forest that can store more carbon, not just in trees, but in the vast, sticky, fungal structures that bind soil and lock carbon away for centuries. Clear-cutting doesn't just release tree carbon. It murders the fungal carbon bank. Suddenly, preserving old-growth forests wasn't just about saving pretty trees or spotted owl habitats. It was about defending a critical piece of global climate infrastructure, a living, breathing, intelligent carbon capture and storage system. The fight to save the forests gained a new, scientific urgency. This understanding began to bridge the bitter divide between environmentalists and industrialists. Forward-thinking businesses in the regenerative agriculture and climate-smart forestry sectors saw the value. Investing in soil health and mycorrhizal networks wasn't philanthropy. It was risk management and long-term asset protection. Insurance companies started to take note. A forest with high network integrity was less likely to burn catastrophically or succumb to pest outbreaks, reducing liability. The language of finance began to merge with the language of ecology. Natural capital, ecosystem services, resilience dividends. The network had economic value. Culturally, the impact was profound. Artists, musicians, and writers embraced the metaphor. Novels were written from the perspective of trees. Symphonies composed with sounds mimicking mycelial electrical signals. The Wood Wide Web became a cultural touchstone for the Anthropocene, a symbol of the interdependence we had ignored but now yearned to restore. It fueled the rewilding movement, not just bringing back wolves, but restoring the soil's fungal connectivity, allowing forests to remember how to be forests. For indigenous communities worldwide, Samard's work was a powerful validation. Their cosmologies, which have always seen plants, animals, and landscapes as kin in a conscious, communicative community, were no longer mythology but predictive science. The Western mind, which had objectified nature for centuries, was finally catching up to ancient wisdom through the narrow, rigorous gate of isotopic tracers and peer review. This created new, respectful partnerships where traditional knowledge holders and network scientists worked side by side, each illuminating the other's path. On a personal, human level, the discovery offers salve for the spiritual malaise of modernity. In a hyper-individualistic, digitally fragmented world, the deep, biological truth of interconnection is healing. People started forest bathing, not just for the fighting sides, but to immerse themselves in the network's energy. Gardening became an act of participating in the web, not dominating a plot. The simple act of touching soil, now known to teem with communicative life, became a grounding ritual. We began to see ourselves not as separate from nature, but as the network becomes self-aware, the part of the web that could contemplate the whole. This shift marks the true birth of the era, not just the era of connection ecology, but the era of reciprocal consciousness. We are moving from seeing the earth as a collection of resources to be extracted, to understanding it as a community of subjects to which we belong. Our survival depends on our ability to listen, to learn its languages, chemical, electrical, fungal, and to act not as masters, but as responsible, humble participants. The Wood Wide Web is our teacher. It shows that strength lies not in isolated competition, but in cooperative networks. That intelligence is distributed. That memory resides in the soil. That death feeds new life. That the individual is sustained by the community. This is the great work of our time, to reintegrate ourselves into the web, to apply this understanding to our agriculture, our forestry, our cities, and our economies, to heal the ruptures we've created. It is a daunting task, but the blueprint is all around us, written in root and fungus, 1 billion years old and patiently waiting for us to read it. And for you, right now, this isn't an abstract future. It is a present peace. As you lie still, you can practice this reintegration. With each breath, you exchange carbon with the photosynthetic network. With each heartbeat, you pulse in a rhythm not unlike the slow flow of sap. You are not a visitor on this planet. You are an expression of it, a thinking, feeling manifestation of the network's most recent explorations. So let go. Let the boundaries of yourself soften. Imagine your awareness spreading out from your body, like mycelium through soil. Feel connection to the plants in your home, the trees on your street, the vast forests across the globe, all linked in a silent, sustaining hum. Your worries are not yours alone. They're signals that can be absorbed and transformed by this larger system. You are supported. You are held. You are home. This is the gift of the discovery. A story that re-embeds us in the world. A story that turns loneliness into belonging, anxiety into peace, and silence into the most profound conversation of all. Let that conversation be the last thing you hear before sleep. Welcome to the final chapter. This is not a chapter of words, but of silence between them. Not a chapter of knowledge, but of the peace that comes after knowing. We have journeyed through discovery, through struggle, through revolution. Now we arrive at the gift the forest has been offering all along, the gift of connection. So let your body settle, as if sinking into a bed of soft moss. Let your eyes gently close, if they haven't already, and listen not to my voice, but to the space around it, the space that holds us all. Feel the weight of your body releasing into the support beneath you. With each exhale, imagine a little tension, a little worry dissolving. Let it go into the air, where the trees will breathe it in and transform it. You are not holding your burdens alone. You are part of a cycle, a great, gentle cycle of release and renewal. Now bring your attention to your breath. Don't change it. Just observe it. The cool air entering, the warm air leaving. This air has been in the lungs of the forest. It has moved through the needles of pines, the leaves of maples, the needles of the fir trees in our story. It carries their essence, and now it carries yours. You are breathing the forest. The forest is breathing you. This is not poetry. This is biology. A constant, intimate exchange at the membrane of your lungs. You are in conversation right now. Now go deeper, beyond the breath to the pulse, the steady rhythm in your chest. Feel it. That rhythm is a wave, an oscillation of life. And if you listen with your imagination, you can sense other rhythms. The slower rhythm of sap rising in a tree at dawn. the almost imperceptible rhythm of a fungal filament, growing cell by cell through the dark soil. Your pulse is one note in a symphony of living rhythms. You are not out of tune. You belong to the orchestra. Let this feeling expand. Imagine your awareness like a soft root, growing down from the base of your spine, down through the layers of your building, through the concrete and the pipes, into the cool, dark, alive soil. Feel it there, the moist earth, teeming with silent activity. Feel your imaginary root, tenderly, seeking connection. And there in the dark it is met, not by emptiness, but by presence, the soft, web-like touch of the mycelial network, a welcoming embrace from the world beneath. You are not an intruder here. You are a long-lost relative coming home. The web recognizes you because you are made of the same stuff. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, stardust, arranged for a little while into a conscious form. The network holds you without judgment, without demand. It simply holds. In this holding there is a profound safety. The safety a seedling feels when it is linked to the mother tree. The safety of being part of something vaster, wiser, and endlessly patient. All the anxieties of your human life, the deadlines, the expectations, the noise, they are stories told in a very small, very frantic room. The network exists outside that room. It knows only the long story, the story of growth, connection, decay, and regrowth. It has seen species come and go. It has weathered ice and fire. Your anxiety is a tiny weather event on its timeless landscape. It is noticed, absorbed, and calmed. So invite that calm now. Let the deep, timeless patience of the soil seep up through your imaginary root. Let it flow into your feet, your legs, your spine. A heavy, warm, grounding calm. It fills your abdomen, your chest, your shoulders. It loosens the knots of thought behind your eyes. Your mind becomes like a forest, clearing, misty, quiet, and still. Now we will repeat a few simple words. Let them be anchors, not commands. As you hear them, simply feel their meaning in your body. Connected. You are connected. Safe. You are safe. Held, you are held. Rooted, you are rooted. Peace, you are peace. Let these words dissolve now. They have done their work. Leave only the feelings they pointed to. The feeling of connection, like an unbreakable thread of light linking your heart to the heart of the world. The feeling of safety, a deep, primal knowing that you belong to the whole, and the whole protects its own. The feeling of being held as if cradled in the roots of a great, ancient tree. The feeling of being rooted solid, stable, unshakable. The feeling of peace, not as an absence of noise, but as the presence of a profound, humming harmony. Now let go of even these feelings. Let them be, without needing to name them. Allow your consciousness to simply be, quiet awareness in the midst of this vast connection. Like a single leaf, aware of the branch, the tree, forest, the sky. You are that leaf, and you are the whole forest. There is no boundary where you end and the world begins. It is all one breathing, living, dreaming system, and you are its dream, a dream of self-awareness for a little while. Let your attention drift to the very top of your head. Imagine a soft, warm, golden light there. The light of pure awareness, of consciousness itself. Feel this light slowly, slowly pouring down over your scalp, like warm honey or sunlight through a dense canopy. It flows over your forehead, relaxing every tiny muscle. It flows over your eyes, inviting a deep, restful darkness. Over your cheeks, your jaw, your throat, carrying with it a profound, heavy relaxation. Your head is becoming warm, weightless, and still. Now let that warm light flow down your neck, into your shoulders. Feel the weight of your shoulders, the weight of responsibility, of carrying. Melt away under this gentle light. The light flows down your arms, to your elbows, your wrists, your hands, your fingertips. Your arms are not limbs to do things right now. They are simply part of the whole, resting, receiving, heavy and warm. Let the light gather in your chest, around your heart. Feel your heartbeat there, in the warmth. Each beat is not just a pump. It is a drum, echoing the pulse of the planet. A soft, slow, foundational rhythm. With each beat, send a warm light deeper into your body. And with each beat, feel a wave of gratitude. Gratitude for this body, this breath, this moment of connection. Gratitude to the web that holds you. Let that gratitude be your only thought. A soft, glowing, wordless thank you. Now the light flows down through your spine, a column of warm, golden peace. It reaches your abdomen, your hips, the deep center of your being. This is your root. Feel it glowing, and from this glow see in your mind's eye that soft, imaginary root, extending again deep into the earth. But now it is not just seeking connection. It is shining. It is a thread of light joining the network, and you can feel, through this thread, the gentle, humming alive presence of the entire web. It is not thinking. It is being. And in this moment, you are just being with it. Pause 150 seconds. The words are almost gone now. There is only sensation. The sensation of light in your body. The sensation of connection beneath you. The sensation of sound around you. This deep, peaceful tone. Let them all blend into one experience. The experience of rest. True rest. Not the rest of exhaustion, but the rest of homecoming. You are home. You have always been home. You were just forgetting. Now remember. Remember the peace of the forest floor after rain. Remember the patience of stone and root. Remember, you are this.